All right, me. It is mid-March, so it's been a while, and I've finished reading Arthur Conan Doyle's The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, which is one of his short story collections involving Sherlock Holmes. Um, I would say that out of the short story collections, I think this is probably probably the most popular one. At least it has a lot of what I would consider very identifiable pieces of Sherlock Holmes stories, um, partially because of my really big introduction to Sherlock Holmes, as is probably a lot of people that are my age, which was the BBC's Sherlock with Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman. But yeah, it's reading the short stories like this, kind of back to back to back, which really gives the sense of why Conan Doyle began to dislike writing Sherlock Holmes so much, right? Because it's one of those things, right, where like, yes, it is populist fiction, and therefore it doesn't feel important, right? It's not these other Arthur Conan Doyle pieces that he wants to write, which are his research things or his explorations into science fiction, which is really a new and burgeoning genre at that point, right? It's populist fiction, and so it feels like it's nothing, right? But then also, because it is inherently a detective story, and I've talked about this with another piece, but like, there's only so much you can do with detective media, right? And it's why procedural shows are done the way that they are, right? And it's like, there's only so many twists and turns to exist, that then becomes, you're just writing the same story in the same font, right? Which then I think just becomes inherently boring, both to write and to read. But then also, you can't turn down the amount of money that he was getting paid to write these same stories over and over and over again, right? It doesn't matter. And what I think also makes it incredibly difficult, is simply the fact of who the Sherlock Holmes character is, right? Because I'll be honest, I'm not all that interested in the character of Sherlock Holmes. I'm way more interested in the character of Watson, than I am Sherlock. But I think a huge part of that comes down to this concept and idea of, like, at least I should say, I'm not super interested in the way Sherlock is presented through the original Conan Doyle pieces, because it's just this character in which you're having to constantly tear down everything and then rebuild it up, and looking at very, very specific things, or just like weird arguments, or like presumptions on the way that things are, right? And it that's the only way that Sherlock ends up working in the way that Conan Doyle presents it, right? Of where everything that is simple has to be difficult, and everything that seems difficult has to be simple, right? That's the entire, because in order for Sherlock Holmes to work as a character, Sherlock Holmes has to be against what is the common idea or the common solution or the easy, like what is thought of as the solution for what's happening, right? And whether that be he finds a very much more complex solution to what seems like a cut and dry case, or there seems to be this huge mess of things going on that no one really understands, and he's the only one that can parse it out and provides a simple explanation for it, right? It's just not right. It's not even same story, different font. It really is same story, same font the entire way through. Which is why I think that Conan Doyle's Watson is just a little more interesting, because I think in other versions of this, right, you want your Watson to be a little bit more engaged with the story, and therefore it is reliant that Watson comes up huge in these moments, or has this other huge stories going along with him, rather than in what seems to be a lot of Conan Doyle's things, in which it's just Watson's just the author of all these stories, and a lot of the time Watson's just kind of clueless as to what's going on, and every once in a while Watson will shoot somebody or shoot a dog, right? But for the most part, it's Watson is just as clueless, and it's with the short stories specifically, it is so much of like the first 5 to 7 pages are it's like the first page is, oh hey, here's this case that we kind of did before. Oh, remember that was crazy. Oh, here's someone else coming to 221B Baker Street. Oh, who could it be? And then Sherlock does something that like, oh, I can immediately identify who they are and what their kind of situation is. And then we get the backstory, right? And then we get the Sherlock asking Watson to go with him. And that's like the first 5 to 7 pages. And then the next 7 to 10 pages is this kind of investigation, in which it's mostly just describing, oh, Sherlock's looking at a whole bunch of stuff that no one else is really looking at. And then the last 3 to 5 pages is this final explanation of how this all works out, through, stuff that you can kind of follow a lot of times throughout the structure of the story, right? For the most part, you can. There's a few that are like, that's kind of an awkward jump in there, or that is a stretch of logic that you need some sort of other information, which is, whatever. Or it could just be good that I'm dumb, right? Either one works. But yeah, right? It's just so like, it is so cyclical in the way that it is, that I get why it was no longer an interest to write. Because like, going back to what the modern day of it is the police procedurals, right? Things that even I grew up on, things like Criminal Minds and NCIS and, those things. It's so much, it's all the same. It's the same episode every single time. It's just that there's these other underlying storylines that make it way more interesting, that show that they are people, right? And that's what makes the stories interesting, which is, I think, why Watson is the interesting character in all of this, even if he hasn't historically gotten the attention that he probably should have, right? So that's that. That's The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle's. Yeah, it took me longer than it should have to read this, just because it was a lot of, do I want to read this? And then also with starting a new job and all of that, just not even finding time to read, but find the willingness to read and not feel like I'm exhausted or feel like, oh, I need to go. I've been sitting at a desk all day, so I need to go and run around, right? There's never this kind of balance that exists. So maybe we'll get that figured out, hopefully, here shortly. But that's that. That's The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes.